I would just give it
Talk about that.
and the bit, not really anything very much. I would just say about, I was going to say something about our seminar series.
Yes, because that was concerning me, that justice.
No, that should be fine. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll do my general.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Good. I'm just going to put this down.
No, it was,
It's a small,
yeah.
I was just explaining to Eduardo that we have a member of the University Council joining us at Dragon Hall this afternoon as well, to add to the fun. And Oren has just shown another member of the University Council around Joanette's house with a bit in Dragon Hall. Yes. I've been on my best behaviour this week.
I think to my
Which thing? There's a lot on tonight. Rupert Everett, yes, I am coming briefly. There's also the Jewish heritage film on which I don't think and they've given me a seat at the front of the bed, which is the last thing I want because I'm lifting it out halfway through. I've got to drive back to Kent tonight. Yeah, I know. I'd love to see whatever it looks like. I noticed that it's a bit of a divider. I said to some people who feel it's coming. So it's obviously an age thing.
Ah, yes, yeah.
I think I'm not sure it's
Oh, brilliant. Oh, funny, I've never seen that.
yeah.
No, I haven't followed his career. I just
Back his friend's wedding.
Yeah.
Shall we start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to start. This room has notoriously appalling and unexpected acoustics, so I'm going to ignore that and just hope that you can at least lip read. I'm Catherine Richardson. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Arts and Humanities, and I've come just to give a very general introduction to the concept of having Professor Marques de Marques here with us today, and the kind of signals that it gives for the sorts of collaboration that we're interested in as a university and particularly as a faculty. We're delighted to welcome him.
Thank you.
He came to give a talk to our faculty executive yesterday, which was extremely inspiring and has already caused other meetings and lots of plans for the future for collaborations that we can undertake. It's tremendously interesting. We heard all about his university and the city in which it sits and the region in which it sits and the type of work that they're doing there as a faculty of I don't think you are called Arts and Humanities, but the Arts and Humanities work, if you like, that they're doing within a predominantly science environment and in a university that's known for its science. And that's very inspiring to us. And I think it's helped us to think really in great detail about where our kind of research and thinking sits in the global higher education world today. That makes it sound rather abstract. But in fact, I think what we've been doing is thinking about particular types of work that we can do. And it's very interesting. So for me, that kind of partnership that your presence here and the programme which you've developed together represents is enormously important. As a faculty, we've got a well, we've got a part of our strategy, but what lies behind that is a strong desire to lead this university in working in a transcultural way. And in fact, Karina's responsible for that from our faculty executive, thinking about what it means to be a global university working in a global environment, what it means to be working with colleagues from other cultures, and how we can learn and share and do that effectively as teachers, as researchers, as people working in and around universities within their regions. So for all of those reasons, we're very, very excited to have you here.
Thank you.
Welcome formally again, and we'll look forward to hearing more about both the programme and also what you're going to talk about today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. So my name's Karina Aviard. I'm the Associate Dean for Postgraduate Research in the Arts and Humanities faculty, and I'm also an Associate Professor in Film and Media Studies. And it's my honour and immense pleasure to introduce Eduardo Marques de Marques, who is a Professor of Anglophone Literature and Literary Theory, and the head of the Graduate School of Letters at Universidade Federal de Pelotas. We're really honoured to host your visit. And as Catherine mentioned, this final talk today is the culmination of a 4-part seminar series that Eduardo and I established over the last few months, based on conversations and ideas for partnerships and ways in which we can explore working together. And one of those was this seminar series to learn more about each other's institutions and the research that's going on within them. So we had 2 speakers from UEA and 2 speakers from Pelotas. So this series is a first step in an important partnership. And it's been brilliant to have you here on our campus to meet our staff and now to be meeting our students, and to see the possibilities that are emerging from those conversations. And that's been really exciting and wonderful. And so this series is important for our partnership, but it's also important on an intellectual level. The question that we put at the center of this was thinking about human and non-human futures in the age of the Anthropocene. It's one of the challenges, the key challenge, if you like, of our time. And arts and humanities and cultural perspectives are crucial in finding ways forward through that, and to understand the complexity, the multifaceted, complex nature of this as an issue and our responses to it, and not just through arts and humanities as a form of communication of issues or a place in which to share emotion. It's fundamental to the way in which we need to think about this issue. And I want to just quote from someone far more articulate and inspiring than me, a young Colombian climate activist and also a very powerful advocate for the place of culture in thinking about ways of dealing with climate change, Samuel Ruben Vincenz. And he said at the closing of the COP30 meeting recently that culture is not a nice to have. It is the arena where public opinion shifts, where misinformation is countered, where mandates are built, and where transformation becomes imaginable. So, welcome. And I'm really excited to hear this paper. The animals are dying. Soon we will be alone here. Human and non-human relations, the climate crisis, dystopian novels from the global south. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the kind words and the opportunity to be here speaking with you today. It's one of those things in which, when Karina and I first started talking about possibilities for collaboration, it was late March, early April. And to see how far we've gotten since then, it's really fascinating. It's something that, of course, stemmed from our particular desires for collaboration, but I think it's just one example of how far we can go when we are followed by people who share our beliefs and desires and interests. So it's amazing for me to be here. But before I start, I am famously known for disrespecting time limits. So if you think I'm running, short of time, please let me know, and I'll find a way to abbreviate whatever's left. It's something that I have to address in therapy at some point, but So as I was saying, well, first I'd really like to thank the invitation, the opportunity to be here today, sharing some of my research, and together with it, sharing some of my anxieties with you. And the reason I use the word anxieties to refer to my research is twofold. For one, my practices always come from the understanding that perhaps more directly and immediately than other arts and other art forms, literature operates as a more direct response to and as a symptom of contemporary social anxieties. And two, many of these grave anxieties have been translated into dystopian narratives for the past 40 years or so. And it's interesting that my entry into the study of dystopian fiction happened about 20 years ago, when dystopia was usually presented as an imaginative exercise, something that, well, it's dislocated in time, it might happen, it could happen, and it's at the same time interesting on a research level, but also frightening to see how dystopia has become our reality, has been becoming our reality. And but what is important is that, in a way, for perhaps the vast majority of the 20th century, whenever we think about dystopian fiction, dystopian novels, dystopian literature, right? Usually what comes to mind are some of these prototypical texts, right? I mean, it's almost impossible to think about dystopian literature without thinking about Huxley's Brave New World. The same way, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, not to think about Orwell's 1984, Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. More recently, and it's interesting to say recently because it's 1985, but more recently, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. But of course, it's also interesting, and I think that's how my interest was piqued into these kinds of narratives, right? That when we enter the 21st century, the genre kind of becomes rebranded into what is now understood as young adult fiction. And this may have been a marketing move, but it reflects also an important social change in the idea that once you market what was then a trilogy, such as the Hunger Games trilogy, towards a young adult audience, this, in a way, presents itself also as a challenge to address the pedagogical potentials of not only literature, but also dystopian literature in a way to perhaps foster the entrance of these young adult readers into a more politically oriented and politically motivated form and sense of life. So, of course, we have the maintenance of adult dystopian fiction throughout the 21st century, and I just bring here some examples: Never Let Me Go by Ishiguro, and of course, the Mad Adam trilogy by Atwood, and especially Atwood moved from a more, let's say, feminist-oriented dystopian approach in The Handmaid's Tale into a more environmentally oriented, so to speak, and I'm going to address that briefly during my talk. But in his entry to the Palgrave Handbook of Utopian and Dystopian Literatures, historian Gregory Claeys proposes that, and I quote, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it has usually been taken to, dystopia has usually been taken to describe two phenomena. real societies which had sunk into despotism, particularly totalitarian regimes produced by Nazism and Stalinism, and the literary refractions of such developments. Such societies typically seek to enslave parts of their population and to keep much of the rest in a constant state of fear in order to maintain order. Widespread alienation, paranoia, scapegoating, and enemy creation typifies most such regimes. Obviously, what Claes is referring here is to the prototypical texts, the prototypical narrative dystopian fiction that we usually think of when dystopia comes to mind. So if we think, for example, of particularly Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984, what we see is that these novels have shaped Western imagination by presenting societies of nightmare, in which control is exercised by the state, either by force or by desire. And I mean desire because it's very important to read Brave New World as a capitalist dystopia rather than a socialist one. So this crystallizes the connection between dystopian societies and surveillance societies. The idea that within a prototypical dystopian society, we're constantly under observation, and every single thing we do or say or even think about, which is the case of 1984, is liable and it carries, of course, a potential for punishment. Now, what happens is that, in a way, the move towards a more realist trend in dystopian fiction in the late 1980s and early 1990s has allowed also the area of utopian studies to stage a strong return, a strong comeback. And arguably, the turning point for that may have been, and this is the suggestion I make in my research, Francis Fukuyama's very polemic and long revised thesis of the end of history, which of course caused him a lot of trouble back in 1992, which is in his book, The End of History and the Last Man. And part of Fukuyama's thesis, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just focus on what's highlighted there, affirms that one of the main outcomes of the victory of liberal democracies over their political counterparts in the civilized world, and these are his words, not mine, is the death of utopian thought. And I quote, "We who live in stable, long-standing liberal democracies face an unusual situation. In our grandparents' time, many reasonable people could foresee a radiant socialist future in which private property and capitalism had been abolished, and in which politics itself was somehow overcome. Today," and by the way, the today is 1992, "by contrast, we have trouble imagining a world that is radically better than our own, or a future that is not essentially democratic and capitalist." Now, I think we can all agree here that neither has history ended as Fukuyama preached somehow, nor do we live in all or the best of all possible worlds. However, Fukuyama's take on the power of liberal democracies to both free us from having to imagine better alternatives of social and political organization, and on the fundamental result that trying to do so would necessarily end in a dystopia if compared to material reality, allows us to acknowledge the power capitalism has to dominate certain discourses and disciplines. In fact, this notion is somehow encapsulated by the famous quote that is time and again attributed to both Frederick Jameson and Mark Fisher, that says that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I'll return to that later. Now, in May of 2023, my home state of Rio Grande do Sul, in the southernmost state in Brazil, was hit by severe floods, and I'm sure that it may have seen that in the news here because this was, broadcast worldwide. The state capital and my hometown of Porto Alegre lies on the margins of a body of river that escapes definition, as it holds characteristics of both a lake, a river, and an estuary. The four major rivers which cross the state, empty in this body of water called the Guaíba Lake, which in turn empties into the Patos Lagoon, which is by the region where I currently live, in the further down south in Pelotas. But geography is not really the point here. Official data reports show that, and just for you to have an idea, on the 30th of April alone, rainfall reached up to 150 millimeters in one day, which is about 50% more than the average precipitation expected for the entire wettest months in the winter. In Porto Alegre, between the 1st and the 12th of May, the average precipitation reached 333 millimeters, over thrice the monthly historical average. Numbers diverge, but it is estimated that something between 160 and 300 people have died either directly, drowning, or indirectly, particularly with diseases such as leptospirosis, which is carried by the mice of rats and usually related to, environments with, hygiene problems. Also, at least 56 people were never found after the waters receded. About 600,000 people were displaced from their homes. 431 of the state's 497 municipalities were somewhat hit by the floods. In Porto Alegre, the Guaíba waters rose up to 5.31 meters. However, in fact, the measurement, and this is interesting to see how the power of discourse and the power of politics operates. The official number is 6.31. That's the number that the government gives us. However, throughout the floods, the government changed the norms of measurement of the rising waters. Initially measured from a point in the riverbank where the depth is 1, the waters rose up to 6 meters. But because this round number was not good, that didn't make, good news, the municipal government decided to change the point in the river from where the official measurements are taken. So we reached the measurement of 5.31. But it may be even greater than 6 meters. That's the point. Whatever the numbers, they're far higher than the previous record of 4.76 meters during the floods of 1941. And since 1941, we hadn't had a flood in that proportion. I bring this example to introduce the idea that the politics of dystopia is no longer centrally or exclusively associated with totalitarian regimes or surveillance societies. The undeniable and growing effects of climate change and the crisis caused by it have become one of the main points of concern for the studies of the Anthropocene. This tentative new geological era, as proposed by Eugene Stormer and Paul Crutzen from the year 2000 onwards, where it gained more traction. Even though the idea of having an actual new geological era was formally rejected by the International Union of Geological Sciences in 2024, the Anthropocene would be then this new geological era in which humanity has become such a planetary force of change that it can already be felt on the crust of the planet. But this is also marked by, and sorry, I have this image here. This is also marked by the loss of biodiversity, a rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the free circulation of plastics and microplastics, even inside our own bodies. Each one of us now has a certain amount of microplastics circulating in our bloodstream, even in our brains, among other things. So the Anthropocene has been widely embraced, and this is where I think the thing we are doing here, the symposium we've proposed is important. This notion has been more widely embraced by the humanities than by the hard sciences that could and should give a more direct response to it. Even though the arguments in defense of the Anthropocene are solid, I would like to propose an alternative to it, which seems to fit best, and it certainly does in my research, especially to the peoples and cultures from the global south, which is the concept of the Capitalocene. And by the way, this is generated by AI, and the prompt was, give me an image where people are happy with the idea of capitalism. And I find it quite intriguing that that's what it came from. That's what it came with. The idea of at least an illusion of union, beauty, desire, lack of differences, or overcoming of differences around the common ideal of a system that is usually presented, or that usually presents itself as the natural form of human organization. The idea that if we take, let's say, 20 people and place them in a faraway planet, naturally they would develop a capitalist system, which is a very powerful narrative, and a narrative that we somehow are complicit with in our daily practices. But I digress. Proposed by Jason H. Moore, the Capitalocene expands on the main ideas of the Anthropocene by adding the social, political, and environmental consequences of capitalism as the planetary force of change. So it's not merely the presence of human beings on the planet, but what we do, how we explore and exploit the planet and each other, that is the planetary force of change. This is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it adds the component of human agency onto the equation, as it is not, as I said, not just the mere presence of humans on the planet that reshapes planetary life, but the exploration and exploitation of Gaia, which leads to the second point, the concept of cheap nature. Moore states, and I quote, that for capitalism, nature is cheap in a double sense. To make nature's elements cheap in price, and also to cheapen, to degrade, or to render inferior in an ethical political sense, the better to make nature cheap in price. These two moments are entwined at every moment and in every major capitalist transformation of the past 5 centuries. End of quote. Important to mention that, to Moore, the Capitalocene does not stand for capitalism as an economic and social system. It is not a radical inflection on the idea of the green arithmetic. Rather, the Capitalocene signifies capitalism as a way of organizing nature, as a multi-species situated capitalist world ecology. This becomes extremely relevant in as much the main nasty effects of capitalism or of the Capitalocene have historically been felt more on the global south than on the global north. And here's where I would perhaps intervene in a way in which the differences of thinking, seeing, imagining the end of the world from the nations and cultures from the global south actually operate. This is an image from the flood that I just referred to, and the horse became famous. The horse actually was named Caramelo because of its color. And the horse stood on the top of this barn for 6 days and nights without access to food or water, in where there were many tentative rescue attempts, but then after 6 days, the horse was rescued, taken to a nice place, and even now he has the status of celebrity. He even has his own Instagram account for whatever reason. So in the sense, prototypical novels, the prototypical dystopian novels have defined dystopia as an imaginative exercise in the sense that they may actually represent and answer contemporary anxieties, but once distant from the cultures in which they have been produced. The dystopian novels from the global south, however, also address centuries of colonialism, the centuries of colonialism that have shaped our cultures. Whereas to the cultures of the global north, the apocalypse is looming, but still temporarily displaced into the future. For us, in the global south, the apocalypse has already happened. However, it becomes paramount to try and define what I mean by the Global South. And here I'd like to use the excellent work by Vijay Prashad called The Poorer Nations, a possible history of the Global South. Because it's not simply a geographical division of the world that is, divided by the equator. No, it needs to be understood as something more complex than that. And Prashad takes as a starting point his earlier monograph, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, in 2007 as a starting point. To him, there are several key differences between the concepts of Third World and Global South. Firstly, whereas the Third World was a political project, unifying post-colonial states organized by shared principles, aimed at the reshaping of the world order by a posture of non-alignment, anti-imperialism, and economic sovereignty, the Global South is a political condition where the only commonalities are those related to its subordinate position within the global economy. And I think that a good example I usually give about this is to see how the United States government, or I should say the United States president, has been applying tariffs into nations whose ideologies he doesn't really agree with, not by economic factors, but just by the sheer imposition of power to maintain this idea of subordination. Thus, the Third World was united under a shared socio-economic vision, seeking economic sovereignty, control over their natural resources, redistribution of local and global wealth and land. The Global South, on the other hand, is united under a shared set of constraints imposed by the neoliberal order, such as debt dependence, fragmented regional alliances, and the weak bargaining power in the global trade. Secondly, the Third World Project was sought to challenge the global order by actively confronting imperialism and the Cold War polarity through institutional vehicles such as the United Nations Trade and Development, for instance, trying to transform capitalism through the power of collaborative actions. The Global South, on the other hand, is shaped by neoliberal global order that makes it difficult to organize unified blocs capable of systemic change. See, for example, how the BRICS, this bloc of nations led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are constantly being undermined by the United States, especially once they've presented the alternative use of different currencies than the US dollar as the currency of international trade. Once this announcement was suggested, we had the imposition of tariffs on Brazil. So the idea is that we are seen as this weak, misaligned group of cultures that don't really know what we want. Thirdly, the Third World Project existed in a moment of rising sovereignty, led primarily by a newfound sense of nationalism, whereas the Global South lives under a state of eroded sovereignty raised by the flow of neoliberal forces materialized mostly not by states, but by multinational corporate power. Lastly, while the Third World was driven by optimism, belief in progress, planning, transformation, and development, the Global South is marked by survival and resistance. In other words, the Third World Project was utopian in nature. The Global South Project by nature is dystopian, unified by popular struggles, democratic experiments, feminist and indigenous movements, and regional cooperation efforts to keep alive the aspiration for global justice. This hope, according to Prashad, is persistent, not naive, not nostalgic, but rooted in the lived struggles of ordinary people. And this alone forces us to reassess the main pillars of dystopian narratives coming from the Global South. In this talk, I will focus on some Latin American novels, but also I tried to incorporate, I did incorporate one novel from Australia, one from New Zealand, to show that even though Global South nations may be in different stages of economic development, they are somehow driven by the forces of an imperial history and a capital/imperial history. But in my research, I have also been looking at novels from Palestine, Egypt, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, South Africa, Afghanistan, just to name a few. The examples I will present here are by no means exhaustive. And as this is a work in progress, and I think this is going to be my life work because I don't see it ending at any time soon, my focus is to identify and share with you some current trends and argue that dystopian fiction from Latin America or even from the Global South may help us redefine the very concept of dystopia. I will skip this because you don't need to do this. I'll just go directly to Donna Haraway. In the construction of collective resistance, or the collective notion of resistance, it necessarily goes through the understanding and the development of epistemologies that address specific problems from the Global South. The idea that the issues from the Global South can no longer be addressed by simply adapting epistemologies from the Global North, because we have a long-lasting tradition and legacy at some point of, for example, Afro-Indigenous epistemologies and other forms of Indigenous epistemologies that also deal with and address issues from a different perspective, a non-Eurocentric white perspective. And somehow we need to bring and even learn how to experiment these ways of perhaps enduring or facing the end of the world. So, what brings these epistemologies together, in my view, is an orientation by a sense of chronic trauma. As all social historical narratives of the arrival of an inevitable future, from colonialism to the mortal effects of climate change, have arrived first in the South. So Global South novels, however, seem to rely on the proposal of creating networks of affect to unite characters by the collective trauma in order not to prevent the end of times from happening, but instead to pass and spend the apocalypse with their loved ones. The idea that we're going to die anyway, but at least we can try and die a decent death. But I would also like to add to this very equation the contributions Donna Haraway has been given to the debate. And in her very thought-provoking monograph called Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin with the Cthulhucene, published in 2016, Haraway rejects the notions of the Anthropocene and of the Capitalocene to propose the notion instead of the Cthulhucene, which, despite the appearance of the word, it is not a nod to Lovecraft's monster, but to the notion of the chthonic, the Greek word related to those who dwell in the underworld, but also whose origin means earth. Haraway's Cthulhucene calls for an ecological reorientation to try to understand the complex tentacular relations between all human and non-human beings, by firstly displacing the anthropos from its illusionary center, connected, of course, to a contemporary philosophical current called object-oriented ontologies, as well as suggests that surviving the current ecological crisis requires forming unexpected collaborations and relationships with other species, which she terms, and I quote, making oddkin. And I quote, all of these stories are allured to proposing the Cthulhucene as a needed third story, a third netbag for collecting what is crucial for ongoing, for staying with the trouble. The chthonic ones are not confined to a vanished past. They are a buzzing, stinging, sucking swarm now, and human beings are not in a separate compost pile. We are humus, not homo, not anthropos. We are compost, not post-human. As a suffix, the word kainos, seen, signals new, recently made, fresh epochs of the thick present. To renew the biodiverse powers of Terra is the symbiotic work and play of the Cthulhucene. Specifically, unlike either the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, the Cthulhucene is made up of ongoing multi-species stories and practices of becoming with, in times that remain at stake, in precarious times in which the world is not finished and the sky has not fallen yet. We are at stake to each other. Unlike the dominant dramas of the Anthropocene and Capitalocene discourse, human beings are not the only important actors in the Cthulhucene, while with all other beings able simply to react. The order is reknitted. Human beings are with and of the earth, and the biotic and abiotic powers of this earth are the main story. End quote. I need water. So, looking back, this notion of affect needs to be understood from a more global ecology that involves us as animals and as part of an ecology from which we're not the center. And perhaps that is the problem, and that has been the problem. As a species, we are not ready to give up our illusion of being and having conquered the top of the ecological pyramid. That idea that we are somehow blessed, I would say, by God or by evolution to have no natural predators. Therefore, we deserve to be on top of this chain, right? But the important thing here is that from what Haraway presents, the understanding of affect also needs to be addressed. And affect here, and I'm using the very interesting work that has been developed, particularly by Melissa Gregg, within this new area of affect studies, to say that affect marks a body's belonging to a world of encounters, or a world's belonging to a body of encounters, but also in non-belonging through all those far-sighted decompositions of mutual incompossibilities. Always there are ambiguous or mixed encounters that impinge and extrude for worse and for better, but most usually in between, end quote. From this perspective, these contemporary dystopias I'm going to present soon present the need to readdress the construction of affective networks, even in times of imminent crisis, such as the climactic one we are currently facing. Important to mention that the affect presented and encouraged by Global South dystopian fiction is usually seen as an ironic alternative to capitalist social organizations, in as much as the human connections are operated by the same desire to end not in despair, but in peace. The irony resides in the fact that by not opposing to the end, by trying to prevent it from happening, which would guarantee the maintenance of capitalism, these narratives accept that the end of capitalism, is only possible through the end of it all. The novels thus imagine the end of capitalism, to go back to the quote by Jameson or Fisher, by killing its primary agents, us. However, the death of humankind is not always literal. And here I bring, just as a matter of provoking the thoughts about perhaps the negative or even pessimistic views of dystopia, a quote by the Canadian novelist Carrie Doctorow, who has this very interesting novel called Walk Away, for those who are interested in the powers of hacking and biohacking as a force of resistance to the forces of capitalism. And his understanding of what dystopias are seems a bit fitting here, and I quote, "Here's how you can recognize a dystopia. It's a science fiction story in which disaster is followed by brutal, mindless violence. Here's how you make a dystopia. Convince people that when disaster strikes, their neighbors are their enemies, not their mutual saviors and responsibilities. The belief that when the lights go out, your neighbors will come over with a shotgun, rather than the contents of their freezer, so you can have a barbecue before it all spoils, isn't just a self-fulfilling prophecy, it's a weaponized narrative. The belief in the barely restrained predatory nature of the people around you is the cause of dystopia. The belief that turns mere crises into catastrophes." End quote. And we finally get to the thesis that somehow orients this talk, that Global South dystopias tend to operate not only in the refusal to acknowledge neighbors as enemies, but in the addressing of affective connections between humans and non-humans as metaphors of a shared history and trauma centered on its resolution, or lack thereof, of the colonial past. And I need water. And now we go to the part that I think you are all waiting for, which is the very talk of the novels, human-on-human relations, or let's talk about the birds and the bees. And the reason why I have this attempt at a funny pun is because birds and bees are usually animals that are associated with the end of times in these novels, either by a presence of terror or by absence. So, what follows now is a very brief and superficial list of contemporary Global South novels that play with such a trend. So I've tried to bring here novels that have been translated into English, but there are two that haven't been yet translated. So I'm sorry for that, but the ones that have been translated are usually very interesting if you are interested in reading them firsthand. And I start with a novel by a Uruguayan novelist called Fernanda Trias, published originally as Mugre Rosa, translated into Pink Slime. The translation is recent, 2 years ago, actually. Trias presents us with an unnamed port town, which for Latin American readers is clearly a post-apocalyptic version of the capital of Uruguay, Montevideo, which has been taken by a mysterious and deadly red fog coming from sea at different times of the day, and which has turned venomous the animals it did not kill, forcing humans to reinvent themselves through a mist of melancholy. The unnamed narrator guides us through her relationship to her ex-husband, Max, who had been quarantined in hospital among the dying many who have been contaminated by the red fog. But what is interesting here is how the notion of the impinging end brought by the birds actually operates. And I quote, "We all expected that the birds would meet the same fate as the fish, that one day they'd start falling from the sky like ripe fruit. We thought we'd watch them all suddenly crash to earth, but no. Instead, we stopped seeing birds. No one really noticed it happening because they left gradually, in flocks. Unlike the fish, the birds vanished without furious cawing or futile deaths. They simply vacated the sky. One morning, the parks were silent, and someone on television said they had migrated, and it was as we'd been given permission to notice it. People went crazy. They headed for the parks with their binoculars. They filled the plazas with breadcrumbs. No one ever saw another bird, not even a pigeon. They gathered a panel of experts on television. The show was called Will the Birds Come Back? And it was the most watched program in history. They invited a state biologist, a civil servant, and several public figures, the usual cast of charlatans. There was a large seagull painted on the back wall of the set. They said migration, sightings, flyaways. They said GPS, radio telemetry. They talked and talked, but silence had claimed the sky. After that, I'd sometimes think I saw a sparrow on a tree branch, heard a call or the flutter of wings, but no, the birds left us to face the red wind alone, end quote. Now, what is interesting here, and perhaps the idea that I would like you to keep, is that these novels, they tend to present animals as harbingers somehow of the impending end. And the idea here, and I think that this quote is very telling, is that no one really knows what to do when it happens. The idea that whatever science, or by science I mean hard science, can present us is not enough, and it will never be enough. That somehow the powers of imagination, the powers of poetry may lead us so far, but they won't give answers either way. The point is that imagination, poetry, literature is not here to give answers. Science is here to give answers. But when science fails, where can we turn? So the idea of calling these scientists charlatans is interesting because it shows how fragile the idea of science and the truths of science actually are. Not can be, but actually are when facing the end. There is another interesting trend. As I said, birds and bees are particularly animals that are used to bring the notion of whose absence shows something powerful, but also dangerous. And I bring here a novel by an Australian novelist called Charlotte McConaghy, Migrations, published in 2020, from which the opening sentence gives the title to this presentation. And I quote, "The animals are dying, soon we will be alone here," end quote. And in this novel, we follow a narrator who, for some reason, needs and finds it as her last alternative, or her last act in life, to follow a flock of Arctic ferns. The last flock of Arctic ferns that are migrating God knows where, and she wants to follow them, to see them die, basically. The idea is that she wants to witness the death of the last species, or the last beings of this species, in order to deal with her own trauma. We learn by reading the novel that the narrator has been faced with perhaps which is the most horrendous trauma that, not most, but one of the most horrendous trauma that a young girl can face, which is finding the body of her dead mother by hanging in her room in Australia when she was 7 years old. And this, in a way, becomes a way for her to not necessarily overcome her trauma, but deal with it. Seeing the death of a species of birds, marking not just the beginning, but the end of a journey. What happens, however, is that unlike other novels, and perhaps this is where the level of social development, economic development of Oceania nations perhaps bring us, is that the novel ends in hope. When the narrator reaches the flock of birds in Antarctica, what she sees is, and I quote, "hundreds of Arctic terns cover the ice before me, squealing and creaking their cries, dancing upon the air with their mates, caterwauling joyously. Sea swallows they are called, for the grace of their dips through the water, and I see it now as they dive hungrily for fish in a sea thriving with what must be millions of scales. I sink awkwardly to the ground and weep," end quote. And in here, well, it is hope, but it is also the recognition that the animals are just leaving us, that they want us to die a death of our own. They don't want to be participants in our own deaths. Therefore, the migration is not the migration as a symbol of a potential return, but an exit in itself. And in a way, we also see this happen to bees. And I think that you've all seen, these reports that whenever the bees are extinct, we can simply say goodbye to our lives because there will be no more pollination. Therefore, everything in terms of biodiversity will be over. So I'm just going to be very brief about these two Brazilian novels that deal with bees and how the absence or the presence of bees can be presented as interesting alternatives. And I bring the first novel called A Extinção das Abelhas, which translates for The Extinction of Bees, and the second one called O Deus das Avencas, which translates as The God of Ferns. In the first one, what we have is a future in which the bees are extinct, and the narrator, who is an older lesbian woman who's facing her own life of trauma, eventually sees herself forming a commune with other women who leave Brazil and go to Argentina in order to try and resist against the impending collapse of civilization. The God of Ferns, on the other hand, is actually not a novel, but it's comprised of 3 shorter novellas, and the one called Bugonia, in which we have, in an unknown future, a community or a society that feeds the corpses of dead humans to bees, to a swarm of bees, and these bees produce in turn something called necro-honey, which is used as a medication to prevent the deaths of humans, therefore creating a sense of symbiosis that is challenged by, because it's a very balanced ecology, and anything that can challenge this ecology must be faced. So you have this community, this society trying to maintain its validity by fighting against outsiders who want to take over control of necro-honey. And of course, the word Bugonia addresses this Roman legend that is presented in Cicero, I think, that bees emerge from the carcasses of dead cows, that bees are naturally, spontaneously generated from the death of larger animals. So, very briefly, I'm going to talk about this, and it's a very intriguing New Zealand novel by Reedy and Thomas called Milk Island, in which it was published in 2017, but it is set in 2023. And in Thomas's novel, what we have is New Zealand, the South Island of New Zealand turned into a prison, much like what we have in the history of Australia. But that's not really the point I want to make. The point I'm trying to, because the novel is called Milk Island, because, and it's comprised of 4 shorter novellas as well. Each one of these novellas brings the national hero of the state, which is a cow called Milky Moo. And this is the opening of the novel, and I quote, "A pastoral scene. Milky Moo, the nation's greatest cow, is being emptied by a humble share milker under the warm light of an April sun in Kaikoura. The cow, famous and beautiful, is indifferent to labor underway below her, and the share milker gently tugs away, handling her with the patriotic care and pride she deserves. The milk spills easily. All is well in New Zealand, and God's grace is everywhere." End quote. And the idea is that even though we, and by the forces of capitalism, try to incorporate the notion of humane caring, humane treatment of animals, and the word humane is peculiarly ironic because there's this idea of treating animals as though they are almost quasi-human. There's no such thing, because the way we understand our position in the ecology of capitalism is always going to be, even through a facade of respect, there's always going to be exploitation. And the moment we are faced with it, what's left somehow is poetry. We use discourse to make this exploitation more feasible, more palatable somehow. But I'm going to just bring 2 other examples to see how this palatability, this feasibility, doesn't usually go as planned. And the first example is this Argentinian novel by Agostina Basterica, published in 2017, whose title in Spanish is Cadáver Exquisito, or what's the word? Delicious Corpse, translated into English as Tender is the Flesh. I don't know how familiar you are with Argentine culture or with, Southern Cone culture, but we're basically carnivores. Our whole diet is based on meat eating. And that's why there's all this debate about veganism in the Southern Cone as an enemy force, and sometimes people really see that as an enemy force. But what Basterica proposes is an understanding of a future in which cows become poisonous. And in order to maintain the consumption of meat, of beef, the state decides, or perhaps, decides, but allows for the slaughtering of humans. And this is part of the opening of the novel when I quote, "Carcass, cut in half, stunner, slaughter line, spray wash. These words appear in his head and strike him, destroy him. But they're not just words. They're the blood, the dense smell, the automation, the absence of thought. They burst in on the night, catch him off guard. When he wakes, his body is covered in a film of sweat because he knows that what awaits is another day of slaughtering humans. And he is the narrator, who is the son of a butcher. No one calls them that, he thinks, as he lights a cigarette. He doesn't call them that even when he has to explain the meat cycle to a new employee. They could arrest him for it, even send him to the municipal slaughterhouse and process him. Assassinate him would be the correct term, but it can't be used. While he removes his soaked shirt as he tries to clear the persistent idea that this is what they are, humans bred as animals for consumption. He goes to the refrigerator and pours himself cold water. He drinks it slowly. His brain warns him that there are words that cover up the world, end quote. And it is interesting here, the power of discourse. Not only that, but who are the humans whose bodies are not meaningful enough to have the life of humans? And of course, here we can address the concepts that are somehow brought by Agamben of bios and zoe, life as social beings and life as animals. We could also bring here the idea of bodies that matter by Judith Butler. Who are the bodies that deserve mourning? Who are the ones that deserve treatment as human individuals? Who are the ones that deserve rights? Now, to end, I want to bring and this is by far the best novel I've read this year. Not that I read much. Also an Argentinian novel by this guy, Michel Nieva, whose original title is La Infancia del Mundo, or The Childhood of the World, but it was translated for some reason into English and into Portuguese as Dengue Boy. Of course, an allusion to dengue fever, the disease that is transmitted by a specific kind of mosquito. And in this novel, Nieva presents us to a world in which the ice caps have already melted, and therefore only the highest areas of the southern hemisphere are possible of having human life. So we have, right in the beginning of the novel, the presentation of the Pampas Caribbean, but also of the Argentine Antarctica, or the Antarctican Caribbean. The idea that only in Antarctica, the temperatures are temperate enough for people to live. Outside these places, no, nothing. But what's interesting is that in this novel, we have, as the main character, a kind of a mutant creature who is a mixture of a human being and a mosquito. And the novel follows the attempts of this creature to live, as a human being, because he's treated by his mother as a human being, even though the other members of society see him as this creature. Long story short, this mosquito creature goes into a murdering rampage against everyone and everything and every institution that he sees responsible, not just for his own existence, but the demise of human life by the melting of the ice caps. And we learn in this novel that the economy is driven by something called viral financialism, in which the stock market actually bets on viruses and epidemics. And of course, we see this happen all the time in terms of big pharma, right? How big pharma operates in terms of testing medical drugs in the global south. And what happens is that the novel presents a way of turning into revenge. Nieva actually calls for action, and I quote a part of the novel in which the unnamed dengue boy goes into the stock exchange, where these traders are actually trading viruses and betting on new epidemics and pandemics, and he simply kills everyone, which is interesting to show how fragile the economical system in which neoliberalism and capitalism is based on actually is. All you need to do is go directly to the source, and the system is, it crashes on itself. Of course, it may rise again, But what is interesting is that they call it and they refer to the La Pampa Stock Exchange crash of 72. Here's 2,372. The idea that by going there, this economy is challenged. So I'm going to skip this, but I just want to end by a quote from Dr. Lawrence Davis, who, when talks about utopia and dystopia, focuses directly on the use of anarchy as an utopian force. And I quote, anarchy may be understood as a correlation of future, past, and present in which past and future coexist with the present conjointly. From this perspective, past and future are always found intertwined with the present, and actions that are undertaken in the present are necessarily entrained in a temporal trajectory that extends into the past and future. It follows that anarchism is as much about the reenactment of the possibilities of the past as it is an ideology focused on the present, or indeed the future. Moreover, historical time is no longer conceived as continuous and homogeneous. The present is no longer understood as the linear result of the past, and historical testimonies and memories are pregnant with living dreams for another and better life, end of quote. And such a notion of time is intrinsically connected to indigenous onto epistemic cosmogonies, which in turn resonate with the multiple non-hegemonic perspectives of life. Now, to end my talk now, I'd just like to say that these revolutionary drives cannot and must not be seen as extreme opposites, but as part of a spectrum that reassesses and reveals the scars left by colonialism, as well as the negotiations, even by use of force, by the way, we have undergone in order to survive. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'll come here so you can. Thank you so much. Gosh, that was a brilliant talk. I have a question.
Okay, sure.
But I wondered if anybody else wanted to begin. Did anyone else have a question? Is there any questions online? Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah. I had a question about your terminology.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really intrigued about what you said about the global south, and also what you, just before you ended, were talking about one of the novels and about the power of discourse. And I wrote down the quote, the words that cover up the world. Mm-hmm. And it made me think about what you were saying about global south as a language of that reproduces marginalization, that reinforces a subordinated position in the world of a certain set of countries and cultures, and where the environmental crisis is most keenly felt right now, and in this sort of subordination also is repressive. And I just wondered, from a sort of linguistic or a discourse point of view, what you thought about the term global majority, and whether, because I think the way that transition from the third world as a term and global south was positioned was one of empowerment, of you no longer this poor sort of basket case of the world, but part of this bigger, I guess, a conglomerate of nations and things that, but this would be a less insulting or condescending way of being described. But what you're suggesting is not.
Well, yeah, there are two ways in which we can address that. By the way, thank you for the question. It reminds me that there's I'm trying to remember the author. I can, of course, pick it up later for those of you who are interested, but there is an interesting book that it is a glossary of words that somehow define a number of global South cultures, written by academics from these cultures. But just the fact that they are written in English kind of, brings the whole discourse into itself. It kind of crashes into itself, because the point of this specific glossary is to try and translate untranslatable words. Of course, we can go through, the possibility of translation, etc. But we're talking about transculturation more than translation in a way. And I'm going to just give an example that perhaps you are very familiar with, the concept of Ubuntu. I am with everyone, this African concept that somehow brings people together. But it's not that. This is me using an European language to try and approximate the concept to what it really is. There's a Brazilian, and interestingly, there are two Brazilian Portuguese words in this glossary, and the one that really strikes me the most is saudade. It's very hard to explain because it's a feeling of missing someone. So, for example, if you miss someone and you're speaking to the person on the phone, you can express this feeling by using the word saudade, but you also express it when you see the person. So it's missing in distance and the absence of missing at the same time. But I mean, trying to explain here, I see how difficult or even impossible it is, other than just living the concept. So that's one thing. When I talk about indigenous ontoepistemologies, and that's part of my research anxiety right now, because I'm doing here exactly what I'm saying that you shouldn't do. I'm speaking to a global North audience in an European language, trying to approximate concepts in order for us to, even for myself to understand, right? And perhaps concepts that, the concept of dreaming in Australian culture.
Yes.
I mean, we have all these books and texts talk about the Aboriginal dreaming, but if you don't live it, it's impossible to really understand. Now, the way we usually deal with these discursive elements, right? And I think you have a point, the idea of the notion of global majority against the notion of minorities. We're still operating under a binomial system, and a binary system. The binary system is maintained. We're still talking about, we're just shifting perhaps a notion or an understanding of power. Because even when we talk about global majorities, who really are part of the global majorities? Not people in power. So in this sense, it doesn't really matter. Perhaps, and I'm just thinking, and it's something that has been bugging me for quite a while, we still haven't invented the words to define the things that exist, the ones that we really need to address in the way that they need to be addressed. But until then, we need to work with the language and the concepts we have. So talking about the epistemologies of the Global South poses a challenge because on the one hand, we want, and I mean we because I am part of this system, to distance ourselves from Eurocentric onto epistemologies. But on the other hand, that's the basis of our scholarship. We cannot simply abandon it and try, we wouldn't even know how to build something from scratch without relying on our legacies. So we are in a conundrum. What do we do from here, linguistically, right? Well, in Brazil, very few people speak indigenous languages. And even if I try to learn an indigenous language, to learn a language is different than living a language and experiencing what the language actually represents, brings, suggests. So I don't think I have an answer for that. That's the thing. And every time I think about it, I become even more anxious because I am, in a way, operating, doing the very thing that I'm telling people not to do. So it's hypocritical at best.
It is, but then there's no communication possible.
Well, yeah. That's what somehow makes me sleep well at night. That there's no other way of doing it than the one that I'm using.
Yeah.
So that's why I said, I mean, we haven't yet invented the language to address these issues or the discourse to address these issues in a way that embodies the real complexity without resorting to, the binary oppositions and whatever.
Thank you.
I think we are recording these sessions, aren't we?
Yes.
So we'll try the mic.
Okay.
We'll do a repetition, so there
Okay, thank you. So I have a question which is kind of connected with what you just said. you mentioned that people in Brazil that don't speak indigenous languages, and there's a difference between living in a language and knowing a language. So what would be your advice with these books that you showed us? I have like a full list.
Learn Spanish, learn Portuguese.
I do speak actually this language as well.
Wonderful.
Here's the thing. So would you say that I should like read them in original? Because like for me, it's even on this more different level, because you're presenting me books in languages I know, and I'm listening also in not my native language to what you're saying. And do you think by learning the languages we can at least somehow understand some concepts, or we are on a losing side and we will never understand them fully?
No, not at all. Well, I am one who myself, I always try to go to the original whenever possible, right? But sometimes it's not possible. So in a way, I think that we have to praise, the works of translators who, think about making, not just, shifting words and sentences between languages, but making it meaningful for people who don't really live the experience of the original, right? If I were to be cruel to you, I would say, well, if you want to understand, for example, Trias' novel, go and live in Uruguay and learn, to how the experience of living actually is translated. But as I said, the work of translators must be praised. And I don't know, what's your native language, by the way? Polish. Okay. Well, if you happen to have access to official published translations of these novels in Polish, that's the second best way. Okay. Because, as I said, the work of translators, and not only that, a good translator is also able to transculturate a text. It's not just about the words. It is about the discourse. It is about the feeling, right? So certain concepts, and I know it's not common in many literary texts, but footnotes are usually a good thing, Sometimes there's a concept that is almost untranslatable, and a footnote usually helps. But we have this, thing about novels that kind of push against it. But again, there are many ways to go about it. Reading the original is one, and the other is reading in translation. I mean, and then you have both. But again, I think that the point is that if it catches your eye, if it catches your interest, go for it. And I'm sure that, by the way, my generation was the first to have access to commercially available internet. And then when I was like 16, 17 years old, I didn't quite know what to do with that tool. Right? Now you all have cell phones, you all have smartphones, you all, live with that. So there are communities of speakers, there are communities of, people who could help you try and understand not just literature, but other concepts of life. And that's something that I would somehow urge you to do. Don't look at the Global South as something to be studied. Don't look at the Global South as something from which you can think you can trade something. Because that's what the colonial gaze has always been. And by the way, I don't believe I'm speaking that in England, right? Because but that's the point. The Global South has been subordinated to the Global North for too long. So even here, I'm talking about these two entities as concepts for pedagogical reasons, right? Because if you look at, for example, the notion of the Global South within the cultures of the Global South, there are many Global Souths, as there are many Global Norths. I'm sure that the experience you have in England is different to the experience you'd have in the United States, even though you belong to the same Global North. So I don't know if I answered your question or even, but...
Yes, you did. It's just I'm always, when I'm presented with a piece of literature that is in another language, I'm haunted by the words of Miyakoto, that his books are not well translated to any language.
Well, but you see, even and it's interesting you should bring him. I don't know if you know Miyakoto, but he's this writer from Mozambique. Yeah, he writes in Portuguese, and even though he's an African author, he's very much white and very much co-opted by the Portuguese canon. In Portugal, they don't really see him as a Mozambican author, they see him as, you know, a global North author. And a lot of, I was going to say something horrible, I was going to say real African authors, but there's no such thing. But a lot of Black African authors who use the Portuguese language to write, if you think of Pepe Tela and others, they have this beef against not only Mia Couto, but also Walter Ugumãe, for example.
And
Agualusa too, yeah. Because they don't see, because these white African authors who have been somehow given access to the Portuguese canon, they don't see them as real representatives of what being African really means. So even in, and of course, it goes back to, you know, the scramble of Africa, it goes back to history, but etc. But even in that sense, right? When we talk about Africa, what Africa are we talking about? When you talk about the global South, what global South are we talking about? So I'm actually urging you to think about the global South from a micro perspective rather than from a macro perspective. Because then we can see, for example, how distinct experiences that compose, that are connected by you know, a common ground, but actually may even present different responses to common crises, and then we can have perhaps a better understanding of that.
thank you.
Thanks so much for this wonderful and inspiring presentation.
Thank you.
About all the literatures that are all new to us, but for me, except for me. I know this uneasy discussion between the global North and the global South, the universalizing ideas around the Anthropocene and then the particularities. And I was following you through the Anthropocene discussion and thinking about the Capitalocene and the Thulacene. But you didn't go further to think about the Black Anthropocene or the Indigenous Anthropocene, Anthroponaut scenes, or the kind of colonial Anthropocenes. You could take it much, much further. And I wonder why you stayed with the kind of like, you went to a certain extent with it and then you stay there. And you also, at the end, you ended with, this is what my question is, like, why did you choose to end with anarchy?
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, indigenous, could we think about the indigenous kind of resistances as anarchists?
Mm-hmm.
And is it so inevitable that we are still in the kind of the capital scene, or could we think beyond and, you know, without it?
Okay, well, thank you very much for your question. Well, the reason why I didn't step into the other scenes was majorly time, you know, because it's, I mean, I'm very much interested nowadays in the necrocene, the notion that this is a system driven by an understanding of death rather than an understanding of life. And you're absolutely correct in feeling perhaps a sense of discomfort in not going further, because the point is that I would say every month a new term comes as a response to more or less the same anxieties, but of course from different perspectives and different, as I say, onto epistemological perspectives, right? The idea that I'm not just creating knowledge, but I am creating knowledge through my living perception, through my perception of life, through my understanding of what's happening around me. Now, the point of anarchy is, in a way, provoking, in a sense that one way of perhaps challenging the capitalist notion or the capitalist order would be the absence of hierarchies, the construction of a horizontal society, a horizontally oriented society. And again, that's why I think Davis presents it as an utopian force. The question I would ask on top of that is, how do we do that? And even if we did know how to do that, are we ready to, you know, develop a new form of orientation in which our humanity is somewhat maintained? And I say somewhat because in many instances our humanity is constructed by opposition. Our humanity is constructed by the opposition of the other's animalities. And perhaps together with the notion that is presented by Harry, and even her herself doesn't use the term Catholicism any longer as much as she did back in like 6 years ago. But the point, I think, that the common aspect is we do have a problem, which is we are all going to die. as a species, as living creatures, the planet is going to die. Now, the strong point she makes about making kin is what perhaps matters and perhaps unites all these other notions of other scenes you've mentioned. Because without these alliances, I mean, we don't know what can happen. I mean, we know what can happen. We don't know what can happen if we decide to give way to these new forms of alliances. And by the way, I think it's important to go back to the idea that these discussions of all these scenes, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, etc., we are making these discussions in the humanities. I mean, we are the ones who are actually discussing these things, right? Now, I would say people in power, in terms of the scientific understanding of power, these concepts are, marginal to them. So it's actually symptomatic that we are discussing this from a forum that is really concerned about things that we sometimes feel we have no power to change. And I think that the first point of making kin, especially from us in the humanities, is that we have to make kin with our scholarship, first of all. We have to understand, and this is something I was mentioning yesterday, we have to acknowledge the power of the humanities to make actual changes, right? If not because I don't know how it is here, but in Brazil, there's always this idea that the humanities are unimportant because we don't make stuff. We keep, talking and thinking and we don't do stuff. But, and that's something I mentioned 3 weeks ago. I was in a conference on the Commission of Science and Literature in Brazil. And I was invited to talk to scientists. I mentioned something that for us perhaps is quite obvious, but for those scientists in the audience was not. There's no science without imagination. And we still as a society tend to place what we do in the field of artistic creation, useless aspects of imagination, whereas what really changes the world is, big pharma. What really changes the world is biotechnology. What really changes the world are those things. But if not by the exercising power of imagination, and I'm not talking about imagination just as fruition. I'm talking about imagination in terms of the power that language and discourse has when materialized into the world. Because that's what we're doing here. So I'm digressing, I know. But the point is that all of these terms that you've mentioned have in common the same desire to address the issues that are important, that are anxiety-driven somehow. But the question I would make in turn is, to whom are we asking those questions? To whom are we addressing our anxieties? Because it's all very well to be here in a room full of people from the humanities sharing these anxieties, but okay, maybe I'm preaching for the converted here already. But we are the ones who know how to mold, and I'm using the word freely here, language, how to change language into discourse, and discourse is action. So I'm sorry, I digressed a lot. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that's as far as I can go right now about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I was trying to think what my question was, but I think it's connecting that last conversation and what you were saying earlier about you talked about how fragile the ideas of science are when you were saying about kind of artists have questions and not answers, but scientists have answers. And I'm really interested in that, in the work that I'm doing, which is in a natural science setting as a social scientist, and is exploring alternative futures and trying to understand people's the kind of interplay that you talked about in kind of past and present and future. Mm-hmm. So I guess my half-formed question is can you talk a little bit more about that, or maybe some advice you have for us in how we relate across those different fields, or how we open up avenues of exploration with all of the different ways in which we understand the world, and science does need imagination and creativity in it.
Thank you for your question. And not only that, I would say that we have to challenge the very discourse of science in the first place. And whenever I have this discussion with my students, I always bring the example of eggs, chicken eggs. The idea that 30 years ago, eggs were poisonous, eggs were dangerous. You couldn't have more than one egg a week, or your cholesterol rates would go up the roof and then you would die. Then a few years later, eggs are the healthiest thing you can have. So, and both of these discourses were anchored by science. So the point is that why do we take the scientific discourse to be universally truth all the time? I think that's the first point, and that's something that scientists are not really willing to do, to deconstruct the idea that science, even though there's this whole debate about, what's the word here? How to talk about science, how to make science accessible to people, right? The first thing we need to address is the value of truth that science still wants to maintain, which, by the way, is only, not only, but even more visible when contrasted to the value of the humanities, the value of literature as something that doesn't do anything, that has no sense to the truth, has no compromise to reality. And that's something that, every first-year student of literature learns perhaps in the very first week of classes, is that literature has no compromise, no commitment to reality at all, which is an interesting fallacy to begin with, because literature feeds from reality, but of course it has no commitment to be a mirror to reality. That's something we leave to science on a common sense, right? So it's usually a dialogue that would be difficult to make with scientists if they are not willing to understand that what they do is plainly discursive in the first place. So to have, for example, projects that deal with science communication, right? It cannot be a matter of the scientists come with the science and we come with the communication aspect, because in that way we're just reinforcing the idea of science as the ultimate truth, as the keeper of reality. But in a way, I think we have to, and by the way, this is something that in the Global South has been a very important discussion. How do we make access to science more democratic? How do we make something available to someone from a disenfranchised background? Because the idea is that science is not really keen on speaking to everyone. The scientific discourse is really hard, in a sense that it's not really open for questioning. So I think that's the first thing we should try and do, to show that there's no science without imagination, there's no science without discourse. And these are the two things we in the humanities are perhaps experts in. So I don't know if that's kind of Sisyphus running up the hill with a boulder and then doing that. I don't know, but I don't see any other way for us to kind of break this binomial. And I think that's the biggest challenge we are facing right now in the humanities. And by the way, if we manage to do that, we reinvent the humanities. We bring the humanities back to the center where it should have never left from. The idea that everything passes through what we do. But maybe I'm just, dreaming. I don't know.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Such a rich and deeply thought-provoking seminar, and also the opportunity for us to be in conversation with you in person today. Is really wonderfully exciting. So let's please just one more time, please thank Eduardo.
Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for coming and supporting this event. We've got a lovely reception.